Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the greatest threat to a sitting Republican president, OS authority, is currently coming not from the opposition party, not from the media, but from the very senators who have spent years defending him? And ask yourself this: if the people sworn to uphold the Constitution believe the executive branch has finally crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed, what does that signal about the stability of our democracy right now? To answer these questions, we must look past the chaotic headlines and the 24-hour news cycle. We have to look at the machinery of the American government itself, which is currently undergoing a stress test unlike anything we have seen in modern political history. This is not a story about a single phone call or a single vote. It is a story about the fundamental distribution of power in the United States, and whether the guardrails designed by the Founding Fathers can withstand the pressure of an executive who views limits as personal insults. Before we dive into the mechanics of this revolt, I want to hear from you. Pause for a second and let me know in the comments. Do you view these dissenting senators as principled defenders of the Constitution, or do you see them as obstacles to the agenda the president was elected to enact? There is no right or wrong answer here. I just want to know where you stand before we unpack the evidence. To truly grasp the magnitude of this moment, we must first examine the nature of the revolt itself, which defies the standard logic of Washington partisanship. In the current political climate, party loyalty is usually the paramount currency. You support your team, you vote the line, and you keep disagreements behind closed doors. That is how the modern GOP, and indeed modern politics generally, has operated. But that dynamic shattered last night, when Republican senators walked onto the floor and voted to strip emergency war powers from a president of their own party. They sent a shockwave through the Capitol. These were not never-Trumpers acting out of personal animus. These were veteran lawmakers, institutionalists, and in many cases, reliable allies of the White House. Their decision to break ranks was not made lightly. It was a calculation born out of genuine alarm, and the reaction from the White House confirmed exactly why they were alarmed. When President Trump learned of the defection, reports indicate that his response was not to invite these senators over for a negotiation or to discuss policy nuances. Instead, he reportedly called Senator Susan Collins and unleashed a profanity-laced tirade that left seasoned Washington operatives stunned. This reaction is crucial to understanding the current crisis. In a functioning democracy, tension between the legislative and executive branches is a feature, not a bug. Congress is supposed to check the president. The president is supposed to negotiate with Congress. However, the president's reaction, shouting, swearing, and issuing threats reveals that he views this constitutional friction not as democracy at work, but as a personal betrayal. To this White House, the separation of powers is an inconvenience, and dissent is indistinguishable from treason. While this political drama plays out, the administration is simultaneously engaging in a series of maneuvers that suggest a broader strategy of executive expansion. At the very moment his war powers were being challenged, the president declared a national emergency regarding Venezuelan oil assets, floated the idea of taking military action against a NATO ally's territory, and allowed promised transparency initiatives to grind to a halt. This is a multi-front war on institutional norms. But to understand why Republicans finally broke ranks at this specific juncture, we have to look at the catalyst behind the vote: the War Powers Resolution and the questions surrounding Greenland. Passed in 1973 in the shadow of the Vietnam War, this law is one of the most sacred break glass in case of emergency tools in the legislative toolkit. It was designed to ensure that no single person, no king, no president, no general, could unilaterally commit the United States to endless combat without the consent of the people, its representatives. For decades, presidents of both parties have chafed against the War Powers Act. but rarely has a president's own party felt the need to invoke it against him. So why now? The answer lies in a story that sounds almost absurd on its face, but carries terrifying geopolitical implications regarding the potential acquisition of Greenland. When the president publicly entertained the idea of using military force or coercive pressure to acquire Greenland, many in the public laughed. It sounded like a joke, a real estate developer's fantasy, but in the halls of the Senate, nobody was laughing. Greenland is not a disputed rock in the middle of the ocean. It is an autonomous territory of Denmark. Denmark is a foundational member of NATO. Let us follow the logic that terrified Republican senators. If the United States were to take military action against Greenland, we would theoretically be attacking Denmark. Under Article 5 of the NATO Charter, an attack on one member is an attack on all. This means that, by treaty, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Canada would be obligated to defend Denmark against the United States. Senator Chris Murphy and others laid this out in stark terms. The President of the United States was floating a scenario that would blow up the post-World War II security order and place America at war with its closest allies. This wasn't about tax rates or health care or immigration. This was about the basic sanity of American foreign policy. Republicans looked at this rhetoric, looked at the lack of restraint in the White House, and realized that if they did not draw a hard line on war powers now, they might not have a chance to do it later. They realized that the president views the U.S. military not as a tool of statecraft bounded by law, but as a personal possession to be deployed based on impulse. The vote to limit his war powers was a desperate attempt to reassert the principle that the power to wage war belongs to Congress, not the king. While the Senate was grappling with the existential threat of a broken NATO, the White House was busy deploying another weapon in its arsenal, one that brings us to the strategic abuse of emergency declarations. Almost simultaneously with the War Powers Revolt, the administration declared a national emergency regarding Venezuelan oil assets. On the surface, the administration framed this as a matter of energy security and geopolitical strategy against the Maduro regime. But we must look closer. The timing of this declaration is suspicious, to say the least. It arrived exactly when the administration needed a distraction, a change of subject to pull the media narrative away from the internal Republican revolt. Emergency powers are a unique and dangerous element of the American presidency. When a president declares an emergency, they gain access to special statutory powers. They can bypass the normal legislative process, redirect funds that Congress has appropriated for other purposes, and act with reduced oversight. These powers exist for genuine crises, hurricanes, terrorist attacks, immediate threats to the homeland, where the slow-moving deliberation of Congress would be fatal. However, using these powers to manage foreign policy disputes, or worse, to manage domestic political headlines, is a corruption of the system. The practical benefits of the Venezuelan declaration are distant and uncertain. Most experts agree that the primary beneficiaries will be multinational energy companies, not the American consumer at the pump. Yet, the declaration serves a crucial political function. It reasserts dominance. It sends a message that says, while Congress tries to tie my hands on war powers, I will use my other hand to seize new powers over the economy. It is a game of whack-a-mole. You try to restrict the president here, and he expands his authority there. The pattern is consistent. Challenge comes, escalation follows, and the language of crisis is used to drown out the demands for oversight. This pattern of executive overreach brings us directly to the third pillar of the current crisis, the systematic breakdown of transparency and the cultivation of the deep state myth. One of the central promises of this administration, and indeed the promise of any populist movement, is to drain the swamp and bring hidden information to light. Yet, as Senator Sheldon Whitehouse and others have documented, the administration has systematically stalled the release of documents and information that they previously promised to prioritize. We are seeing a growing gap between rhetoric and reality. The administration claims to want transparency, but when deadlines arrive, the documents are missing. When explanations are demanded, silence follows. This has led to formal requests for Inspector General reviews. It is important to understand what an Inspector General IG review actually means. In the polarized language of cable news, everything is framed as a partisan attack, but IGs are usually career officials, the internal auditors of the government. When a senator asks for an IG review, they aren't necessarily accusing anyone of a crime. They are signaling that the basic machinery of government has broken down. They are saying the process isn't working, and we need to know why. But to a president who demands total loyalty, an independent auditor is a threat. This administration has cultivated a mindset where any objective set of facts, any record that contradicts the president's narrative, is treated as a weapon of the deep state. This is dangerous because records and documents are the memory of the government. If the executive branch successfully stonewalls Congress and refuses to provide documentation, it effectively blinds the legislative branch. Congress cannot oversee what it cannot see. The friction that the founders designed, where Congress asks questions and the president must answer, is being replaced by a stone wall. And when that happens, the presidency ceases to be a public office and begins to resemble a private enterprise, accountable only to the CEO. With these stakes in mind, we have to ask why the dam is breaking now. What is the Republican calculation driving this shift? For years, political observers have asked, where is the line? What would it take for Republicans to break with Trump? For a long time, the answer seemed to be nothing. The prevailing strategy among GOP lawmakers was one of quiet management. The calculation went like this: support the president publicly to keep the base happy, confirm conservative judges, pass tax cuts, and try to manage the president's more volatile impulses through private counseling and adults in the room. That calculation is now collapsing. It is collapsing because the adults in the room are gone and the impulses are getting dangerous. But more importantly, it is collapsing because lawmakers are starting to think about the future. This is the precedent trap. Republicans in the Senate are realizing that Donald Trump will not be president forever. Whether he leaves office in 1 year or 5 years, from the perspective of the time, eventually a Democrat will sit in the Oval Office. And that Democrat will inherit every single power that Republicans allowed Trump to seize today. If Republicans establish the precedent that a president can float military action against allies without pushback or declare national emergencies to bypass Congress whenever it suits them, they are handing a loaded weapon to their future political opponents. Imagine a future progressive president declaring a climate emergency to seize control of the energy sector, citing the precedent set by Trump's border or oil declarations. Imagine a future president threatening military action against a nation simply because they dislike their trade policies. The quiet management strategy failed because it assumed norms would hold on their own. They don't. Norms only hold when people enforce them. By staying silent for so long, Republicans allowed the exception to become the rule. Now, they are looking at their own legacy and the future of the conservative movement, and they are realizing that saving the institution of the Senate might require opposing the leader of their party. They are asking themselves, do I want to be remembered as the senator who waved through the destruction of congressional authority? For a handful of them, the answer is finally no. However, placing the burden solely on the shoulders of elected officials ignores the deeper structural rot that allows this executive hubris to flourish, the weaponization of hyper-partisanship among the American electorate. We must confront the uncomfortable reality that the president does not operate in a vacuum. He operates within an ecosystem where a significant portion of the voting public has been conditioned to view compromise as capitulation and institutional norms as elitist constraints. This is the tribal shield, and it is perhaps the most formidable obstacle to reining in executive overreach. In previous eras, such as during the Watergate scandal, public opinion eventually coalesced around a shared set of facts. When the tapes revealed Nixon's complicity, his support among Republican voters eroded, which in turn gave Republican lawmakers the political cover they needed to push for his resignation. The feedback loop worked. The leader abused power. The people saw it. The people withdrew support, and the representatives acted. Today, that feedback loop is broken. We live in an era of negative partisanship, where the driving force of political behavior is not affection for one's own party, but a profound existential fear of the other side. For many voters in the president's base, the Democrats are not just the opposition. They are viewed as an enemy that threatens the American way of life. When the stakes are elevated to that level of apocalyptic urgency, the rules of the game, like the War Powers Act or Inspector General protocols, seem trivial by comparison. If you believe your political opponents are trying to destroy the country, you will forgive your own leader almost any transgression if you believe he is the only thing standing in their way. The president understands this visceral dynamic better than anyone. It is why he frames every investigation not as a legal inquiry, but as a witch hunt designed to disenfranchise his voters. He transforms a constitutional question into an identity crisis for his base. This dynamic creates a polarization paradox for Republican senators. They know intellectually and constitutionally that the president is accumulating dangerous powers that will eventually be used against them. But they also know that their primary voters, the people who actually decide their political fate, do not care about the nuances of the War Powers resolution. These voters consume a media diet that reinforces the president's narrative of persecution. If a senator votes to restrict the president, they are not hailed as a defender of the Constitution back home. They are branded as a traitor to the movement. This is the terrifying innovation of modern populism. It turns the check on power, the people, into the enabler of power. Consequently, the quiet management strategy persisted for so long, not just because senators were cowardly, but because they were responding to the incentives of a broken information environment. They were trapped in a pincer movement, squeezed by a president who demands total loyalty on one side and by a base that punishes any deviation on the other. This context is what makes the recent vote on war powers so extraordinary. These senators are not just defying the White House, they are defying the gravity of their own political universe. They are betting that there is still a silent constituency for the rule of law, or at least that the judgment of history matters more than the wrath of a primary challenge. It is a gamble that strikes at the heart of the American experiment. Can a republic survive when the voters themselves are willing to trade checks and balances for the illusion of a strongman? This is a hard question, but I want to ask it. Have you seen this tribal shield in your own conversations? Have you seen people defend actions they would have condemned 5 years ago just because their side is doing it? I am genuinely curious to read your experiences in the comments. I think we need to talk about this dynamic more openly. Now, it is easy to dismiss all of this as inside the Beltway drama, but we need to confront the real-world cost of this institutional chaos. I need you to understand that this abstract constitutional chaos has direct, tangible consequences for every American family. Stability is the bedrock of a prosperous society. When the rule of law is strong, businesses can plan for the future. They know the rules won't change overnight. They hire, they expand, they invest. But when the whims of one man can reshape nations overnight, that stability evaporates. Think about the markets. Investors hate uncertainty. If a president can declare an emergency and disrupt trade or seize assets on a whim, the risk premium for doing business in America goes up. Your retirement account, your 401k, is directly tied to the stability of these institutions. Think about the military families. When the chain of command becomes confused, or when military objectives are driven by political rhetoric rather than strategic necessity, the risk to service members increases. The parents of soldiers deployed abroad need to know that their children are only being put in harm's way after rigorous debate and constitutional authorization, not because of a temper tantrum in the Oval Office. Think about the cost of corruption. When transparency dies, graft flourishes. If the government stops releasing documents and stops answering questions, tax dollars start disappearing into the pockets of the well-connected. The emergency declaration regarding Venezuelan oil is a prime example. Who benefits? Not you. Not the average citizen. It is the large conglomerates with the access to lobby the White House. This instability trickles down. It creates a psychological weight on the country. It is the anxiety of waking up every morning and checking the news to see if the world has turned upside down while you slept. A country cannot function at peak capacity when it is constantly bracing for impact. The stress test of democracy is also a stress test on the mental health and economic security of the citizenry. So, facing this landscape, the question becomes, where do we go from here? We are in uncharted waters, but looking at the patterns of history and the current political landscape, we can map out 4 potential futures. The first possibility is that the pushback grows. In this scenario, the courage of the few encourages the many. The senators who voted against the president find that they are not punished by voters, but perhaps even rewarded for their independence. This empowers others to step forward. We could see a reassertion of legislative branch authority, more votes to limit war powers, subpoenas that are actually enforced, and a blockade on the abuse of emergency declarations. This wouldn't mean the end of the Trump presidency, but it would mean the return of checks and balances. It would be a messy, combative relationship, but it would be a constitutional one. Conversely, the second possibility is that the pushback fades. This is, historically speaking, the most likely outcome. The White House exerts maximum pressure. Primary challenges are threatened. Donors are squeezed. The media cycle moves on to the next scandal, and the senators who voted for the War Powers Resolution quietly retreat. They return to the fold, rationalizing that unity is more important than principle. If this happens, the precedent is cemented. The executive branch effectively swallows the legislative branch, and we move closer to an elected monarchy where the president's word is law until the next election. A third possibility involves an external crisis. Politics does not happen in a vacuum. A major external shock, a genuine war, a financial collapse, a massive natural disaster could reset the entire board. In moments of genuine crisis, the public typically rallies around the flag and the leader. The administration knows this. It is why the temptation to manufacture crisis is so high. But if a real unmanageable crisis hits, all these debates about war powers and transparency will likely be swept aside in favor of immediate survival. This is the wildcard scenario that renders all predictions moot. Finally, the fourth possibility is the triumph of process. This is the boring scenario, but perhaps the most hopeful one. It involves the slow, grinding gears of bureaucracy doing their job. The Inspector General reports are eventually finished and released. The courts slowly rule on document disputes, forcing the administration to comply. It is not dramatic. It doesn't make for good television. But it is how the system self-corrects. It is the victory of regular order over chaos. If the institutions are strong enough, they will eventually wear down the resistance of the executive branch through sheer persistence. I want to turn this over to you. Which of these four possibilities do you think is actually going to happen? Are we looking at a constitutional revival or a slow slide into an elected monarchy? Drop your prediction in the comments below. As we bring this breakdown to a close, let's consider what is truly at stake, not just for the presidency, but for the very soul of the nation. We are not just debating procedural rules or Senate parliamentarian decisions. We are debating the definition of the United States of America. Are we a nation of laws where power is constrained, defined, and temporary? Or are we becoming a nation of men, where the law is merely a tool to be used by the powerful to punish enemies and reward friends? The founders fought a revolution to ensure that we would never have to bow to a king. They built a messy, slow, frustrating system called the Constitution, specifically to prevent the accumulation of total power in one set of hands. They knew that human nature is flawed. They knew that ambitious men would always seek more power. So they pitted ambition against ambition. They gave Congress the sword and the purse to check the president. For 250 years, that system has held. It has survived civil war, depression, and world wars. But it has survived only because men and women in power decided that the Constitution was more important than their political party. The Republicans who voted against their president on war powers were not just casting a vote. They were keeping a promise. They were validating the idea that the oath of office to protect and defend the Constitution means something. The outcome of this struggle will not just determine the trajectory of the current presidency. It will determine what kind of country we hand off to our children. If we allow the normalization of emergency powers as political tools, if we accept that transparency is optional, and if we shrug when our leaders threaten our allies, we are dismantling the inheritance of liberty that was given to us. The system works only if we make it work. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires attention. It requires engagement. And sometimes it requires the courage to say no to the people we usually agree with. If you found value in this analysis, please hit that subscribe button. It helps more people see this kind of in-depth breakdown. And don't forget to share your thoughts on the Precedent Trap below. I'll be reading through the comments to see what you think. Stay vigilant.